Now, it's time for application. The thing you want to watch out for on the 15.5s is make sure you've got the right flywheel and the right disc. You've got 3 flywheel bores. Now, what I mean by flywheel bore, that's right here. This is the center of the flywheel. And that's also where the disc has to sit into. Your three bores are 7 1/4 in diameter, which you'd use your old style 8-spring disc. You've got an 8.5-inch diameter, which is fit for all your 10-spring discs, and you've got a 9 3/4 inch diameter, which is what this one is. Now, normally we used to go by wherever the flywheel bore was, that's what you put in it. It still holds true today. If it's a 9 3/4 inch hole, you put a 7-spring in it, or if it's a Mac, you put a 9-spring. If it's an 8.5-inch bore, you put a 10-spring in. If it's 7 1/4, you put an 8-spring. Well, a lot of people have been doing some different variations here in the last few years, is they've been going back with 10 springs in places of the 7s because they felt they lasted longer. So the 8.5 would fit in both the 8.5 plus the 9 3/4. But always check the bore size. Now, Macs are one thing you really got to watch out for. I'm going to remind you, when you're talking about 9 springs, that's a Mac clutch, which means there's 9 springs in the disc. Watch out and question your customer to make sure he's not talking about the cover with 9 springs. Otherwise, you're going to put it in, it will not work. Mac is the only thing you can use a 9-spring disc on. If you try to use it in anything else but a Mac, the 2 springs that fit on the inside will hit the flywheel mounting bolts. So beware of that. Make sure you got plenty of clearance. It actually doesn't hurt to fit it up in there. Now, the next thing we want to talk about is we're saying we're using 10 springs in places of 7s. Well, it was working pretty good for a while, but now the situation has arose with the FRO transmission series. Well, the FRO, or let me show you, has got a lot smaller teeth on it. Also, most of them are used in what we call a low emission engine, which means they idle at a lower RPM, which means they idle rougher than normal. Well, all of these are known as free travel discs. Basically, this area here determines your free travel. The more room you got, the more hub movement you get. If you run a 10-spring disc, such as this, it's only got basically about a 1/4 inch of free travel, the roughness of that idle will transmit through the clutch into the transmission. What happens is you got slop in the main gear to the input shaft. You get a rattle. Now, that rattle is detected by, if you raise the RPM rates up by as little as 100 RPMs, everything smooths out. The rattle itself doesn't really hurt anything as far as damage to the transmission or the engine. It's just an annoyance to the driver. But if you want to not take a chance on having a rattle, always run a 7-spring in the FRO series. Now, if you run a higher horsepower clutch, first of all, you can do this 2 ways. This is a 4-paddle disc. This is a 6-paddle disc. This will generally raise basically your torque rating by a couple hundred foot-pounds of torque just due to the friction. Now, the advantages of a 4-paddle versus a 6-paddle has always been the clutch business. And when you're talking about a button-style clutch, that the more friction you have down at one time, not only is the clutch stronger, it's less aggressive. That's the key to it. We want to calm down more or less the buttons so they're not so aggressive. So a 6-pad clutch will be a smoother clutch, plus it will probably last you somewhere around twice as long, especially in construction vehicles. So just something to consider. A lot of people think, well, if I put that heavier clutch in, that's too much clutch. No, that's an old wives' tale. You can never put too heavy a clutch in a truck. It's not going to hurt anything. A clutch does not produce torque. It only transmits whatever the engine produces into the transmission. So the heavier the clutch, it handles more torque. It does not create torque. Now, there's a lot of these guys out there right now that are running these real high horse engines. And also, a lot of them are running what's called an ECM device. Bully Dog comes to mind, where they increase the horsepower and the torque through the ECM module. You've got to watch out and make sure you've got enough clutch to handle that. Otherwise, you're going to have premature clutch failure. We have a clutch known as a VHD. I'm going to pass around here. We're going to go to this poster. These are known as VHDs. There's two styles. One of them has got what they used to call the old spline saver, which means it's got an extra hub, and then the disc rides on the extra hub. The next one is a 7-spring disc, a lot beefier than a normal 7-spring. These are 500 up to 600. We don't really advise selling clutches to anybody over 600 horse. Then you're getting into the high performance range. But these are up to 600 horse. Now, we more or less go by horsepower rather than torque. Torque is important, don't get me wrong, but also horsepower is. So that's how we prefer to rate our clutches. Usually on your average 4-paddle, up to about 450 horse on a 4. And when you bump that up to the extra friction with the 6, then you're going to move that up to 2050 or 500 horse. And anything above a 500 horse, you want to go into the VHD series. Now, going back and talking a little bit, this is the Mac 9-spring. Again, the extra 2 springs will cause you a problem in any other flywheel except for a Mac. Now, one more thing we want to talk about is the Volvos. I'm going to step back around. Volvos, we have a special clutch, and we designate it by putting an H at the end of the part number for the hydraulic clutch. And what it is, in some Volvos, we build our normal plate load on our regular 15.5s with a 4,000-pound spring. And sometimes that's too much for the slave cylinder and will cause a hard pedal. So with the Volvos, we actually put a 3,600-pound spring in it, and that helps it accommodate the hydraulic linkage so you don't have a hard pedal. Now on the Volvos, since the bearing is actually mounted upside down, rather than this way, it's mounted like this, just as it is on a Mac, the bearings are dual drill. This is your normal, where your normal grease strip goes in. This is for the Volvos and for the Macs. So, gentlemen, that kind of concludes the application. And now, these are the people who answer the phones at Mid-America. This is a chance of putting a face to the familiar voice you hear at all times. This is Todd, Kent, Jamie, and Stacy.
Okay. If you have any further questions about this video or any of our product line, be sure to give us a call at any time. We'll be glad to help.